The drill sergeant screamed, "This will break you," to a room full of terrified recruits. One human woman just smiled and asked, "When does the real training start?" You see, the Crucible program was designed to crush spirits across the galaxy, but it never accounted for someone who actually enjoyed the process. The Crucible wasn't just another training facility. It was a galactic institution built on a single brutal premise perfected over generations. You see, the Dominion had refined psychological warfare into a precise recruitment ritual that treated fear as a measurable input rather than an emotional response. For centuries, they documented every species' predictable reaction patterns, creating what they considered the ultimate breaking machine. Drill Sergeant Nextar served as the program's primary instrument. His size and vocal projection calibrated to trigger specific fear responses across different physiologies. The room itself was part of the apparatus. Overhead lighting angled to cast shadows across his face. Temperature controls set to induce discomfort without physical danger. Even the acoustics engineered to make his voice resonate through bone. They measured success through biometric readouts. Elevated heart rates, cortisol spikes, the precise moment when fight or flight shifted to pure submission. Historical military studies would recognize the pattern. Institutionalized brutality follows predictable cycles where systems designed to break individuals eventually become self-perpetuating, regardless of actual effectiveness. Psychological breaking techniques rely on removing all sense of control, and the Dominion had perfected this through environmental manipulation. Recruits entered a space where every variable was calculated to maximize disorientation, from the metallic scent pumped through ventilation systems to the precisely timed delays between commands. The program's designers understood that consistent, predictable terror yielded consistent, predictable results. Across 8 standard cycles, not one recruit had deviated from the expected response curve. The system operated with the smooth efficiency of machinery that had never encountered an irregular component, until it met Mira. Where others saw an imposing figure of absolute authority, she observed what amounted to theatrical staging. The lighting choices, the vocal projection techniques, the carefully managed pauses, she recognized them as performance elements rather than genuine threats. Her reaction wasn't defiance so much as professional appreciation of craft. The machine designed to break spirits encountered someone who treated terror as theater, psychological warfare as interesting methodology. This interruption represented more than just an anomaly in their data streams. It suggested the entire system contained flaws they'd never considered, that their perfect breaking machine might actually be rather fragile when confronted with someone operating outside its parameters. The institution that had spent centuries refining how to break people was about to discover what happens when someone refuses to play their game by their rules. Her cheerful question about when the real training would start wasn't just impertinent, it was the first thread in the unraveling of their entire operational philosophy. Mira's entrance violated every established parameter of Dominion. Behavioral science, though she passed through the same reinforced doors as the rest. Recruits typically entered a state of primal fear within 3.7 seconds of Nextar's address, a statistic backed by 8 standard cycles of unchallenged data. Their pupils dilated, respiratory rates spiked, subvocal tremors registered on acoustic monitors. The system considered these reactions proof of concept. Mira, however, simply stood there observing the room like a critic at an opening night. Her cheerful interruption sliced through the carefully calibrated fear frequency like signal interference. Where the program expected whimpers or rigid silence, she offered an enthusiastic self-introduction. She actually complimented the acoustics, praised the program's reputation based on what she called really compelling reviews from past participants. It would have been amusing if it weren't so. Fundamentally disruptive to the entire operational premise. Cognitive dissonance occurs when expectations violently clash with reality, and that's precisely what unfolded in that room. Nextar's presence, engineered to trigger submission responses, now registered as mildly interesting performance art. The script called for fear. She was following a different script entirely. You see, her preparation signaled a completely different engagement model from the start. She arrived with energy bars in her pocket, hydration supplements, even a wrist-mounted device that quietly logged biometric feedback. She'd studied the training modules beforehand, knew the obstacle course layouts, understood the physiological stressors she'd encounter. Preparedness psychology shows that knowledge dramatically reduces threat perception. What others saw as a chamber of horrors, she viewed as a demanding but well-designed fitness program. This wasn't resistance. Resistance would have still operated within the system's binary framework: fight or flight, defiance or submission. Her approach was something else entirely: enthusiastic participation on her own terms. She treated the Dominion's premier breaking facility like an all-inclusive retreat she'd been looking forward to attending. The program designed to crush spirits encountered a subject who saw it not as punishment, but as an exciting challenge. A puzzle to be solved rather than an ordeal to be endured. Her question about when the real training would start wasn't sarcasm. It was genuine curiosity. She assumed this theatrical display was merely the introductory theater before the substantial work began, that the actual building of capability would follow the breaking of spirit. What she didn't realize, what the Dominion hadn't realized, was that the breaking was the entire program. There was nothing after it. The system assumed that once broken, recruits would be ready for obedience training. They never considered someone might skip the breaking part altogether. Her question would soon prove disturbingly literal, because she was about to demonstrate what real training actually looked like. Nextar's entire methodology faced its first genuine failure in 8 standard cycles. Not a partial breakdown or statistical outlier, but a complete operational collapse. The drill sergeant's psychological toolkit contained protocols for defiance, terror, even catatonic withdrawal, but no contingency for enthusiastic cooperation. His training manuals offered no guidance for recruits who seemed to be evaluating the quality of instruction rather than fearing the instructor. Where centuries of psychological conditioning had taught others to see an imposing figure of absolute authority. Mira observed what amounted to an interesting architectural feature. She noted his vocal projection techniques, the careful staging of his physical presence, even the way shadows fell across his uniform to emphasize his size. She didn't register threat. She registered technique. Authority derives power from perceived legitimacy, which genuine enthusiasm systematically undermines. When someone treats your terror display as performance art, the entire power dynamic shifts from hierarchical to observational. Her calm questioning reframed the entire interaction from punishment to partnership. While others flinched at his commands, she asked clarifying questions about scheduling and equipment specifications. She sought operational details rather than showing submission. Power dynamics fundamentally shift when one party simply refuses to recognize the established hierarchy. It's not rebellion. It's operating on a completely different set of assumptions about how the interaction should proceed. The system expected fear-based compliance. She offered collaborative engagement. This wasn't defiance in any recognizable form. Defiance would have involved challenging his authority, resisting commands, perhaps even physical confrontation. Those responses still operate within the system's conceptual framework. What Mira demonstrated was something more disruptive. She behaved as if the system's rules didn't apply to her because she wasn't playing the same game. She treated the Dominion's carefully constructed terror environment like a particularly challenging orientation session at a new job. Psychological warfare requires fear to function. Without that underlying current of apprehension, the entire apparatus becomes meaningless theater. Nextar's imposing presence, calibrated to trigger specific physiological responses, became merely a loud instructor delivering information. His threats, engineered to break wills, became suggestions about training methodology. The transformation was both subtle and total. The machinery of psychological domination only works when participants accept their role in the dynamic. When someone rejects that role entirely, the machinery grinds to a halt. The real test would come on the obstacle course, where theory met practical application. Nextar watched Mira's unnerving composure with a growing sense of professional unease. The psychological components had failed, but the physical challenges remained. The course was designed to break bodies when minds proved resistant. He assumed her calm demeanor would shatter when confronted with actual physical danger, rather than psychological theater. What he couldn't anticipate was that she'd been waiting for this part all along. The psychological games were merely the opening ceremony before what she considered the real work began. The proving ground became a demonstration of redefined purpose. You see, the obstacle course was designed to eliminate nearly 3/4 of recruits through physiological and psychological overload. razor wire crawls under simulated artillery fire, electrified water obstacles, vertical climbs with intentionally unreliable handholds, each element engineered to push beings beyond their perceived limits. The Dominion philosophy held that only those who broke and rebuilt themselves could become effective soldiers. What they hadn't considered was someone who might approach their carefully constructed nightmare as an interesting set of engineering problems. Mira moved through the course with analytical curiosity, rather than survival instinct. Where others saw deadly hazards, she observed structural design choices. She noted the precise angle of the rope netting, the calculated spacing between unstable platforms. Even the specific frequency of the strobe lights meant to induce disorientation. While recruits ahead of her froze at the edge of the electrified water trench, she calculated current patterns based on visible emitters. Performance research shows that interpreting stress as excitement rather than threat dramatically improves outcomes. She wasn't experiencing fear. She was experiencing what psychologists call flow state, where challenge level matches skill level with clear goals. Her running commentary provided a stark contrast to the grunts and screams echoing through the course. She praised the structural integrity of climbing walls while effortlessly navigating them, complimented the efficiency of the pendulum axe mechanism as she timed her passage between swinging blades. Nice weight distribution on these counterweights, she noted while scaling a wall that had caused 3 previous recruits to fall into the safety nets below. The course record wasn't just beaten, it was demolished with what sounded like a technical evaluation seminar. Observers monitoring her biometrics registered something unprecedented. Where typical recruits showed spiking cortisol and adrenaline levels, her readings indicated focused concentration patterns more commonly associated with complex problem-solving than survival situations. Her heart rate remained steady, respiration even, with none of the physiological markers the system associated with extreme stress. She completed sections in half the expected time while offering suggestions for improving obstacle efficiency. The moat could be deeper, she mentioned while swimming across it. The climbing ropes might benefit from better moisture-wicking properties. She finished the entire course in record time, not breathing heavily, already reviewing her performance metrics on her wrist display. Interesting how the vestibular disruption obstacles affect different species differently, she noted to a stunned instructor. The rotating tunnel needs recalibration for beings with more than 2 legs though, too much rotational inertia. What the Dominion designed as ultimate test of endurance became, in her hands, an enjoyable learning experience with room for improvement suggestions. This was no fluke or statistical outlier. It represented a completely different operating system for engaging with challenge, one where obstacles became opportunities for optimization rather than threats to be survived. The physical proving ground, like the psychological conditioning before it, had failed to produce the intended result. Instead, it demonstrated that their entire approach might be fundamentally misguided. The gravity chamber became something entirely different from its intended purpose. What the Dominion designed as a chamber of broken dreams transformed into an impromptu laboratory of human performance science. You see, twice standard gravity was meant to crush both bodies and spirits through exhaustive repetition, until recruits either broke or submitted completely. The philosophy was simple. Overwhelming physical stress would accomplish what psychological pressure could not. They never considered someone might treat punitive exercise as voluntary strength training. Mira moved through the crushing gravity with focused efficiency, while others struggled to breathe under the load. Where recruits gasped and strained through mandatory push-ups, she explained core stabilization techniques that reduced spinal compression. While trainees collapsed during squats, she demonstrated proper breathing patterns that improved oxygenation under extreme pressure. Exercise science consistently shows that technique optimization dramatically improves performance under load, but the Dominion's approach prioritized breakdown over form. Their method assumed struggle was the point rather than an indicator of poor technique. Her real-time coaching created immediate improvements among nearby recruits. She called out suggestions about time under tension principles and repetition pacing that allowed muscles to work more efficiently. Control the negative phase, she advised a struggling being from a low-gravity world. The gravity's doing half the work for you if you manage the descent properly. Knowledge of physiological processes reduces perceived effort during exertion, turning what felt like torture into manageable physical challenge. Recruits who moments before were on the verge of collapsing began completing sets they couldn't finish minutes earlier. The torture chamber began sounding like an advanced fitness seminar. Mira discussed muscle recruitment patterns during overhead presses, explained how fascial tension distributed gravitational load more effectively, even commented on the chamber's temperature and humidity settings relative to optimal performance conditions. The instructors monitoring the session found themselves taking notes despite themselves. They'd been trained to watch for signs of breakdown, not optimization. Their metrics tracked failure points, not improvement curves. What emerged was the first visible crack in the Dominion's entire training philosophy. Recruits began performing better through understanding, rather than mere compliance. The being who couldn't complete 5 push-ups now managed 12 with improved form. The trainee who collapsed during squats learned bracing techniques that made the movement manageable. They weren't just enduring the gravity, they were learning to work with it. The chamber designed to break spirits became a classroom for building capability. This shift represented more than just improved performance numbers. It suggested the Dominion's approach might be fundamentally backwards. They assumed breaking had to precede building. That suffering was necessary before growth could occur. What Mira demonstrated was that understanding could replace suffering. That teaching could achieve what coercion attempted. The gravity chamber, like the obstacle course before it, became a demonstration that their methods weren't just unpleasant, they might be inefficient. The real revolution wasn't that recruits performed better. It was why they performed better. They weren't pushing through pain, they were applying knowledge. The difference between struggle and practice, between endurance and skill. The chamber's heavy air, once thick with grunts of effort, now carried the quiet murmur of technique discussions and breathing patterns. The sound of breaking had been replaced by the sound of learning. This wasn't just a different outcome. It was a different process entirely, one that would soon force the Dominion to reconsider everything they thought they knew about training effectiveness. Rexman arrived expecting to find a malfunction in the training program, something that would explain the anomalous data streaming from the Crucible facility. What he witnessed instead was something the Dominion had never documented: evidence-based enthusiasm in action. You see, the department had protocols for every type of system failure, but none for when the system started working better than designed using methods they'd never considered. Mira's approach wasn't random cheerfulness, but applied performance science. Where the Dominion saw disruption, she practiced systematic optimization. Her methods drew from principles completely foreign to their training manuals. Positive psychology research shows specific benefits for resilience and performance under stress, but the Dominion's philosophy treated suffering as the goal rather than a byproduct. Their approach was the antithesis of building mental toughness through structured challenge. Concepts like hormesis, where mild stressors improve resilience, formed the foundation of her methodology. She treated the Crucible's challenges as controlled exposure opportunities, rather than punishments to endure. The science of stress adaptation clearly shows that controlled exposure builds capability when paired with recovery. But the Dominion applied maximum stress without considering adaptation cycles. Their method assumed breaking was necessary before building could occur. Hers demonstrated that intelligent engagement with hardship could prevent breaking altogether. This wasn't resistance to difficulty, but sophisticated engagement with it. Where recruits traditionally viewed obstacles as threats to survive, she reframed them as opportunities to develop specific capabilities. The difference was fundamental. One approach created trauma. The other built competence. The Dominion's metrics tracked failure rates. Her approach measured improvement curves. They monitored breakdown points. She tracked skill acquisition. What seemed like positivity was actually stress optimization methodology. Her cheerful demeanor wasn't emotional state but operational strategy. She understood that how beings interpret stress dramatically affects physiological responses. The same physical challenge could trigger panic or focus depending on mental framing. The Dominion's approach guaranteed the former. Hers cultivated the latter. The recruits themselves began transforming under this approach. Beings who entered the program expecting to be broken discovered they could become stronger instead. The shared adversity that typically produced isolated suffering began creating mutual support. Where the Dominion's method prevented bonding to maintain individual vulnerability, her approach demonstrated that shared challenge could build trust when framed cooperatively. This shift represented more than improved performance numbers. It suggested their entire philosophy might be backwards. They assumed suffering produced strength. Her methods demonstrated that understanding could replace suffering. That teaching achieved what coercion attempted. The chamber designed to break spirits became a classroom for building capability through applied science rather than brute force. The recruits weren't just enduring better. They were learning differently. The difference between struggle and practice, between surviving and understanding. The sound of grunting effort gave way to quiet technique discussions. The atmosphere of dread transformed into focused concentration. This wasn't merely a different outcome. It was a different process entirely. Rexman watched as Mira demonstrated breathing techniques that improved oxygen uptake under heavy gravity, explained how muscle groups could share load more efficiently, even discussed the chamber's environmental controls relative to optimal performance conditions. The instructors monitoring the session found themselves taking notes despite their training. They'd been taught to watch for signs of breakdown. Now they observed optimization in action. The weaponized positivity wasn't a malfunction, it was an upgrade. The system designed to break individuals was discovering that building them worked better. That capability could be developed without first destroying spirit. That the strongest soldiers might be those who never broke at all. The recruits themselves became living proof that their methods might be fundamentally misguided. The Dominion program intentionally prevented bonding to maintain individual vulnerability. Their philosophy held that isolated suffering created obedient soldiers, while camaraderie produced unpredictable loyalties. They designed every aspect of training to ensure recruits faced challenges alone. Separate sleeping quarters, staggered meal times, even individual performance metrics that discouraged cooperation. The system treated unit cohesion as a security risk, rather than a tactical advantage. Mira's coaching created mutual support where there was supposed to be isolated suffering. She noticed a recruit from a low-gravity world struggling with balance exercises, and demonstrated weight distribution techniques that another species might find useful. She organized impromptu technique sessions where recruits could share species-specific insights about overcoming particular obstacles. What began as scattered individuals became a network of shared knowledge. Recruits began interpreting pain as information to be shared rather than endured alone. Where one being might experience muscle fatigue as failure, another would recognize it as an opportunity to discuss recovery techniques. A recruit's difficulty with balance became a group discussion about center of gravity variations across different physiologies. Shared hardship builds trust and communication when framed cooperatively, transforming individual struggle into collective problem solving. Techniques improved through collective intelligence rather than individual struggle. A being with hydraulic joint structures demonstrated leverage principles that helped carbon-based life forms lift heavier loads. A species with natural armor plating explained impact distribution techniques that reduced injury rates during falls. Group cohesion significantly improves performance in extreme environments because diverse perspectives create better solutions than any single approach. The very thing the program tried to prevent, unit cohesion, became its greatest strength. Recruits began anticipating each other's needs during challenges, spotting weaknesses in techniques and offering suggestions before instructors could identify failures. The isolation that was meant to keep them vulnerable instead created a network of mutual support that made them more resilient. They weren't just enduring together, they were learning from each other's differences. The recruits became more capable as a team than they ever were as broken individuals. Their combined knowledge created solutions that no single species could have developed alone. A water-breathing recruit's understanding of fluid dynamics improved everyone's swimming technique. A desert species' heat management strategies helped others conserve energy during endurance trials. The diversity the program tried to suppress became their greatest asset. This emergent cooperation represented a complete reversal of the Dominion's intended outcome. They'd designed the crucible to produce obedient soldiers through psychological breakdown. Instead, they were creating a highly effective team through shared purpose and mutual support. The recruits weren't just surviving the training, they were improving it through their collective intelligence. The transformation wasn't merely emotional bonding, it was practical collaboration. Recruits developed hand signals to communicate during noisy exercises. created shorthand terms for common challenges, even developed modified techniques that worked better for mixed-species teams than the standard Dominion methods. Their cooperation produced tangible improvements in performance metrics that the program's designers had considered immutable. This unit cohesion would soon face its ultimate test in the simulation chambers, where theoretical cooperation would meet practical application. The Dominion designed their final evaluation to break individual spirits through overwhelming pressure. They assumed isolated recruits would crumble under coordinated attacks. They never considered that the recruits might coordinate better than their simulated opponents. The very thing they tried to prevent had become the program's most unexpected strength. Nextar's role transformed from destroyer to creator against his will, an institutional identity crisis playing out in real time. The sergeant's professional identity had been built around breaking spirits to create obedient soldiers, his entire career measured by failure rates and submission metrics. He knew how to recognize the precise moment when a recruit's will collapsed, the subtle shift in posture, the fading of defiance in the eyes, the acceptance of external authority over internal resolve. This was the craftsmanship he'd spent cycles perfecting. Then came Mira, presenting leadership as inspiration rather than intimidation with demonstrably better results. She argued that building capability produced more effective soldiers than breaking will, a concept that sounded like heresy within Dominion doctrine. Where his methods relied on fear compliance, hers demonstrated that understanding could replace obedience. Transformational leadership consistently outperforms coercive leadership long-term across military organizations. But the Dominion had built their entire system around the assumption that broken soldiers made more reliable instruments. Their philosophy treated individuality as a flaw to be eliminated rather than a resource to be developed. His purpose shifted from annihilation to facilitation of potential, though not without professional whiplash. Identity reconstruction occurs when old methods fail and new ones prove objectively superior, forcing practitioners to confront the possibility that their expertise might actually be limitation in disguise. Nextar watched recruits respond to Mira's coaching, with improvements his methods had never produced. They weren't just complying, they were understanding. The difference between robotic obedience and intelligent engagement became increasingly difficult to ignore. The destroyer began imagining himself as a creator of excellence, however reluctantly. Where he once saw raw material to be broken down, he started seeing potential to be developed. The recruits weren't adversaries to be conquered but partners in capability building. This shift represented more than changed tactics. It was a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between trainer and trainee. Leadership became about inspiring belief in mission rather than fear of authority, transforming the dynamic from domination to collaboration. You see, the Dominion's approach had always assumed motivation needed to be externally imposed. Fear of punishment, desire for approval, avoidance of pain. Mira demonstrated that the most powerful motivation came from within, the satisfaction of overcoming challenges, the pride of developing skills, the camaraderie of shared accomplishment. These weren't soft concepts but measurable performance factors. Recruits trained through understanding consistently outperformed those trained through compliance across every metric that mattered. The mirror experiment would test these new methods against Dominion standards, pitting the emerging philosophy against centuries of institutional tradition. Nextar found himself in the unusual position of defending approaches he would have dismissed as ineffective just cycles earlier. The destroyer of spirits now advocated for building them up. The sergeant who measured success by breakdown rates now tracked improvement curves. The transformation wasn't complete, but the direction was unmistakable. The institution designed to break individuals was discovering that building them worked better, and the man trained to be their chief breaker was becoming their most unexpected builder. General Golnick arrived expecting to witness catastrophic failure rates and psychological breakdowns, the standard outcome of the mirror experiment across 8 standard cycles. The 72-hour simulation was specifically designed to break careers through coordinated psychological and physiological stressors that left even successful participants medically retired. What he observed instead defied Dominion military doctrine so completely that it required reevaluating their entire understanding of extreme stress. Performance Mira's team treated the simulation as a complex problem to be solved rather than endured. a fundamental shift in approach that changed everything. Where previous groups had focused on survival, they approached each challenge with analytical precision. Problem-solving orientation reduces stress and improves performance in crises by reframing threats as solvable puzzles. They didn't see enemies to be feared. They saw variables to be managed, systems to be understood, and opportunities for optimization. The team improvised improvements to the exercise itself while maintaining unit cohesion, something the simulation designers had considered impossible. When environmental controls created hazardous temperature swings, they repurposed thermal blankets into insulation for critical equipment. When communication jammers disrupted standard channels, they developed hand signals based on multiple species' visual capabilities. Adaptive capability is the hallmark of high-functioning teams under stress, but the Dominion had designed their training to prevent exactly this type of innovation. The generals witnessed something their system was supposed to make impossible: coordinated execution with energy reserves that defied Dominion physics. Recruits completed objectives with efficiency that suggested they weren't just surviving. They were operating well within their capabilities. They moved through the simulation with coordinated precision, conserving energy through intelligent pacing and mutual support. Where the program expected drained, broken beings barely crawling across finish lines, they encountered a team that had clearly held something in reserve. The team completed what was considered an impossible simulation with energy to spare and coordinated precision that resembled professional military units rather than broken recruits. They didn't just meet the objectives, they improved upon them, developing more efficient routes through obstacle courses, creating better supply distribution systems, even identifying flaws in the simulation's own design. Their performance suggested the Dominion standards might be set embarrassingly low relative to actual capability potential. The Dominion's understanding of military training was fundamentally overturned in that observation chamber. They'd built their entire philosophy around the assumption that breaking was necessary before building could occur. That suffering produced strength. That obedience mattered more than capability. The evidence now suggested the opposite might be true, that building capability first made breaking unnecessary. That the strongest soldiers might be those who never broke at all. This wasn't merely better performance metrics. It was a different quality of performance entirely. The recruits demonstrated strategic thinking, where the program expected reflexive obedience. They showed innovation where conformity was required. They exhibited mutual support where isolation was designed to prevail. Every aspect of their performance challenged the foundational assumptions of Dominion military training. The simulation included psychological warfare elements, specifically designed to shatter unit cohesion, false communication suggesting betrayal, simulated casualties meant to trigger despair, even holographic recreations of personal traumas. Where previous groups had fractured under these tactics, Mira's team treated them as interesting psychological challenges to be analyzed and overcome. They discussed the techniques being used against them, developed countermeasures, and even praised the sophistication of certain psychological operations while neutralizing their effectiveness. The mirror experiment was meant to be the ultimate validation of the Dominion's breaking philosophy. Instead, it became the most compelling evidence for its replacement. The recruits emerged from 72 hours of continuous stress not as broken vessels ready for obedience programming, but as capable professionals who had clearly grown more competent during the experience. They finished with improved skills, stronger unit cohesion, and what appeared to be genuine professional satisfaction. General Golnek left the observation deck with reports that would trigger a reevaluation of training protocols across the entire galactic military infrastructure. The evidence was too compelling to ignore, the results too dramatic to attribute to Uran. The system designed to produce broken soldiers had inadvertently demonstrated how to create unbreakable ones instead. The generals confronted the uncomfortable realization that their system produced objectively inferior results, a conclusion that shook the foundation of galactic military doctrine. For centuries, the Dominion had operated on the unshakable belief that breaking spirits created obedient and effective soldiers, that psychological demolition preceded reliable reconstruction. The evidence now demonstrated that building capability from the outset produced superior operational effectiveness across every measurable parameter. The data streaming from the Crucible facility showed recruits performing better, recovering faster, and cooperating more effectively than any previous class in the program's history. Broken people don't make good soldiers. Discovering inner strength creates unstoppable ones. This wasn't motivational theory, but observable fact demonstrated through performance metrics that even the most skeptical generals couldn't dismiss. Historical military evolution consistently shows progressive improvements in training methodology, with organizations that adapt to evidence outperforming those clinging to tradition. The Dominion had reached a point where their methods represented institutional inertia rather than operational effectiveness. The human approach wasn't softer, it was more sophisticated and evidence-based, incorporating principles the Dominion had overlooked in their focus on compliance. Scientific approaches to training consistently outperform traditional methods because they replace assumption with observation, dogma with data. Where the Dominion used psychological pressure as their primary tool, the human methodology employed stress optimization, controlled exposure, and cognitive reframing techniques that produced better results with less collateral damage. It was the difference between using a sledgehammer and a surgical instrument. Both could achieve force application, but one did so with precision and minimal unnecessary damage. The entire galactic military training paradigm required complete revision based on what the mirror experiment revealed. The Crucible stopped breaking recruits and started showing them they were unbreakable, transforming from an institution of psychological demolition into one of capability development. The shift wasn't merely procedural but philosophical, where once they measured success by breakdown rates, they now tracked improvement curves. Where they had sought submission, they now cultivated competence. The transformation represented more than new techniques. It was a fundamental rethinking of what military training should accomplish and how it should achieve those goals. The implications extended far beyond this single program, suggesting that the Dominion's entire military infrastructure might be operating on outdated assumptions. Their training philosophy had remained static while their technology advanced, creating a situation where sophisticated equipment was operated by soldiers trained through methods that hadn't evolved in centuries. The human approach demonstrated that methodology mattered as much as technology, that how they trained could be as important as what they trained with. This paradigm shift revealed that the Dominion's focus on breaking individuals had caused them to overlook the more effective approach of building capabilities. Their system assumed vulnerability created obedience, but the evidence showed that confidence created effectiveness. They believed isolated suffering produced reliability, but the data demonstrated that mutual support enhanced performance. Every assumption underlying their training philosophy was being contradicted by the results. Coming from their own facility, the transition from breaking spirits to demonstrating unbreakability represented more than improved outcomes. Changed the very nature of military service within the Dominion. Recruits who previously entered service with psychological trauma now graduated with professional confidence. The military that had relied on broken individuals following orders began developing capable professionals solving problems. The shift affected retention rates, operational effectiveness, and even the relationship between military institutions and the societies they served. The implications would soon extend beyond military training into broader organizational structures, suggesting that the Dominion's entire approach to building effective institutions might require similar reconsideration. The methods that had failed in military training likely affected other areas where breaking was preferred over building, where compliance was valued over capability. The revolution beginning in the training facilities would eventually reach every level of galactic military operations and beyond. Earth's military observed the Crucible results with professional interest rather than ethical outrage, a response that initially confused Dominion analysts. You see, where other species saw institutional brutality requiring condemnation, human strategists recognized sophisticated training methodology hidden beneath the surface disruption. Their assessment teams noted the precise environmental controls, the carefully calibrated stress intervals, the systematic approach to pushing physiological limits. What the Dominion framed as punishment, Earth's analysts identified as poorly optimized capability development. Military organizations often adopt successful methodologies from adversaries, but this situation presented something far more unusual. Instead of protesting the program's brutality, Earth's representatives sought to adopt and improve the methods through formal diplomatic channels. Their request specifically highlighted the program's measurable success in producing resilient soldiers, while politely ignoring the psychological damage typically involved. The approach demonstrated a characteristically human ability to separate methodological effectiveness from ethical concerns when evaluating military applications. Their interest focused specifically on Nextar's transformed leadership approach rather than the original breaking techniques. Cross-cultural exchange often produces innovative hybrid approaches, and Earth's military clearly recognized the potential in combining Dominion stress methodology with human capability-building philosophy. They weren't seeking to import brutality, they wanted to adapt the underlying stress application systems while replacing the destructive psychological components with their own developmental approaches. The sergeant, originally designed to break humans, became their most desired instructor. Through this strange institutional alchemy, Earth's assessment teams noted how his methods had evolved from psychological demolition to capability facilitation under Mira's influence. They saw value in his understanding of multi-species physiology, his experience with extreme stress application, and his unexpected transformation from destroyer to builder. His background made him uniquely qualified to help design training that could challenge humans without breaking them. Earth formally requested to recruit the very drill sergeant originally intended to break human recruits, creating bureaucratic confusion throughout Dominion channels. The irony wasn't lost on either side. The institution designed to produce soldiers capable of defeating humanity now found itself exporting training methodology to them. The request represented a complete inversion of the expected power dynamic, with the supposedly superior military system becoming the source of innovation for what they'd considered a lesser power. The joke landed with particular cosmic irony when considering human capabilities relative to Dominion expectations. Where the Dominion had designed the crucible to break human spirits, humanity instead broke their training methodology and then asked to borrow their lead instructor. The species they'd intended to dominate through psychological warfare instead demonstrated superior understanding of stress optimization and performance enhancement. The entire situation suggested that human military science might be more advanced in methodology while less developed in technology. This unexpected interest revealed fundamental differences in how the two civilizations approached military development. The Dominion had focused on technological superiority, while their training methods remained stagnant. Humanity maintained technological inferiority, but demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human performance and capability development. Their request for Nextar highlighted this divergence. They sought the practical experience he represented rather than the weapons technology the Dominion typically exported. The Dominion found itself in the unusual position of considering whether to grant access to their formerly secret training methods to a species they'd recently considered potential adversaries. The decision involved weighing security concerns against the potential benefits of cross-training and methodology exchange. Some strategists argued that sharing training techniques might create future vulnerabilities, while others suggested that incorporating human methods could strengthen their own forces. Earth's interest ultimately forced the Dominion to confront the possibility that their training philosophy might need fundamental revision. The fact that another military organization saw value in their methods while rejecting their underlying philosophy suggested that the two might be separable. That the brutality wasn't necessary for the effectiveness. That capability development could replace psychological breaking as the core training objective. The request also demonstrated humanity's characteristically pragmatic approach to military science. They showed no offense at having been targeted by the program, expressed no moral outrage at its methods, and displayed only professional interest in its measurable outcomes. Their focus remained consistently on practical effectiveness rather than ideological purity, an approach that sometimes concerned their galactic neighbors while simultaneously making them unexpectedly effective partners in certain military endeavors. This development would eventually lead to the creation of hybrid training programs that combined the best elements of both approaches. But for now, it simply represented one of those moments where galactic expectations collided with human practicality. The species that was supposed to be broken by the Dominion's finest training instead asked to hire their head instructor, a situation that perfectly encapsulated the ongoing reevaluation of human capabilities happening across galactic military circles. General Golnick asked what humans consider fun, expecting to hear about recreational activities, perhaps aquatic sports or gravity-free dancing or whatever harmless diversions might occupy a species' leisure time. Mira's answer instead reframed the entire concept of enjoyment around capability development and the active pursuit of challenges. Where the Dominion separated work from pleasure, humans integrated them in ways that initially seemed paradoxical to other species. Their idea of fun involved progressive overload, skill acquisition, and measurable improvement, concepts the Dominion associated with labor rather than recreation. Human special forces treated extreme challenge as engaging professional development, viewing hardship not as something to be endured, but as opportunities to be sought. This perspective reveals a fundamental cultural divergence in risk perception and challenge acceptance. Where other species developed safety systems and comfort technologies, humans created entire industries around making physical exertion more difficult and less comfortable. They voluntarily sought experiences that other civilizations would consider punishment, treating adversity as the raw material for personal growth, rather than something to be avoided. Cultural differences in risk perception vary widely across galactic societies, but humanity's relationship with challenge represents something particularly distinctive. They embrace difficulty not despite the discomfort involved, but precisely because of it. The saying, "no pain, no gain," encapsulates this philosophy. The understanding that growth requires struggle, that capability develops through overcoming resistance. This worldview transforms suffering from something to be avoided into a resource to be utilized, a means rather than an end. The general was about to encounter a completely different relationship to adversity than anything in Dominion experience. Where their training focused on breaking individuals through psychological and physical duress, human methodology emphasized building resilience through controlled exposure and progressive challenge. The difference was fundamental. One approach created trauma, the other developed competence. One manufactured obedience, the other cultivated capability. The Dominion system assumed vulnerability was necessary for control, while human methods demonstrated that confidence created effectiveness. Humanity's idea of fun involved levels of challenge that concerned other species, because it revealed a barely tamed appetite for difficulty that seemed almost pathological from the outside. They didn't just endure hardship. They actively created it for themselves, designing increasingly difficult tests of their own capabilities. This appetite for difficult pursuits eventually became the galaxy's new training ethos, though initially it appeared reckless to civilizations that prioritized safety and predictability. The human approach to training involves reframing the purpose of suffering from punishment to pedagogy. Instead of viewing adversity as something to be inflicted until breaking occurs, they treat it as information about current limits and opportunities for growth. Pain becomes temporary data rather than permanent damage. Challenge becomes measurement rather than threat. This philosophical shift transforms the entire training dynamic from something done to recruits into something done with them, from imposed suffering to shared development. Mira's enthusiasm for the Crucible program demonstrates this cultural tendency to embrace challenges rather than avoid them. She viewed what was designed as psychological torture as the ultimate test, approaching it with excitement rather than fear. This proactive engagement with adversity represents a defining human characteristic, the tendency to see difficulty as opportunity, challenge as invitation, and suffering as potential growth. The species that was supposed to be broken by the Dominions, training instead treated it as the most interesting professional development opportunity they'd encountered. This philosophical shift would redefine galactic military training standards by replacing breaking with building, fear with understanding, and obedience with capability. The approach that initially seemed soft actually proved more rigorous because it demanded more from participants. Not just compliance, but engagement. Not just endurance, but improvement. Not just survival, but mastery. The method that appeared kinder actually created tougher soldiers because it developed internal resilience rather than enforcing external compliance. The human concept of fun ultimately revolutionized galactic military training by demonstrating that effectiveness didn't require brutality, that capability could be built without first breaking spirits, and that the strongest soldiers might be those who never learned to view themselves as weak. This wasn't just a different training methodology. It was a different understanding of what makes beings effective under pressure and how institutions should develop those capabilities. The revolution began with a simple question about recreation and ended up changing how multiple civilizations understood the very purpose of military training. The destroyer's methods became the foundation for galactic-wide reform, in one of those institutional ironies that only emerge when systems collide. Nextar's identity had been meticulously built around breaking spirits across species, his professional worth measured in psychological collapse rates and submission metrics. The man who once took pride in recognizing the precise moment when a recruit's will dissolved now found himself leading a revolution in capability development. His transformed approach became the model for cross-species military training, not through force but through demonstrated effectiveness, creating the strange spectacle of the galaxy's premier breaker, teaching others how to build. The protocol that once meant psychological destruction now signified capability development. Though it retained the original name through bureaucratic inertia, methodologies often retain names while completely changing substance, creating linguistic archaeology where terms outlive their original meanings. The Nextar protocol became standard across multiple military systems, its definition shifting from systematic psychological deconstruction to evidence-based resilience development, without anyone bothering to change the documentation. The form still asked for breakdown statistics, but instructors now entered improvement metrics instead. Earth specifically sought his experience with the human approach to training, recognizing the unique value of his hybrid perspective. Hybrid approaches often combine the best of different methodologies, and Nextar represented the perfect synthesis of Dominion structure and human philosophy. He understood the mechanics of stress application from his original training, but now paired it with capability-building techniques learned through observation. His value wasn't in either system alone, but in the integration of both. The precision of Dominion methodology combined with the effectiveness of human psychology. The sergeant found purpose in building rather than breaking, an occupational transformation that initially felt like professional treason before settling into genuine conviction. Where he once measured success by the number of recruits who broke during training, he now tracked how many discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed. The satisfaction proved different but deeper, creating competence rather than enforcing compliance, developing strength rather than exploiting weakness. His identity reconstruction followed the evidence. The methods produced better soldiers, so the methods were better. Simple professional logic, however reluctant the initial acceptance. His name became associated with creating unbreakable soldiers rather than broken ones, a complete inversion of his original legacy. The Nextar protocol now meant building confidence instead of destroying it, developing resilience instead of exploiting vulnerability. The change represented more than semantic shift. It demonstrated that institutional transformation could occur when evidence overwhelmed tradition. The methodology that began as psychological warfare evolved into capability development because the results were too compelling to ignore. The implications for galactic warfare training were profound and far-reaching. Military organizations across multiple systems began adopting the revised approach, discovering that building soldiers worked better than breaking them. The shift affected everything from recruitment strategies to retention rates, from operational effectiveness to interspecies cooperation. The Dominion's entire philosophy of military training required re-evaluation based on the evidence emerging from their own facilities. This transformation extended beyond mere technique into fundamental philosophy, where military training had focused on creating obedience through psychological pressure. The new approach developed capability through understanding. Where the old system produced soldiers who followed orders, the new method created professionals who solved problems. The difference proved significant. In field operations where unpredictable situations required adaptive thinking rather than robotic compliance, the Nextar protocol eventually became the standard for interspecies military training, its name forever associated with building rather than breaking despite its origins. The sergeant who was trained to destroy became the galaxy's foremost builder of military capability, his methods studied across countless systems. The irony wasn't lost on him. though he eventually stopped seeing it as irony and started viewing it as professional evolution. The destroyer of spirits had become the creator of competence, and the galaxy's military forces became more effective as a result. Adversity became a resource to be managed rather than a threat to be feared, a fundamental philosophical shift that redefined the entire purpose of military training. The Dominion viewed hardship as something to be inflicted until breaking occurred, measuring success by collapse points and submission rates. Their approach treated challenge as punishment, pain as deterrent, and suffering as necessary preparation for obedience. The system operated on the assumption that broken soldiers made reliable instruments, that vulnerability created controllability, that fear produced compliance. This philosophy had remained unchallenged for centuries because it consistently produced predictable results within its narrow parameters. The human approach treated challenge as information about current limits and growth opportunities, transforming the entire training dynamic. Where the Dominion saw threats to be survived, humans saw puzzles to be solved. Where others registered danger, they recognized potential. This cognitive reappraisal of stress significantly changes physiological responses, turning panic into focus and dread into determination. The same physical obstacles triggered different neurological patterns based on how recruits interpreted their purpose. The Dominion's methods guaranteed fearful responses. Mira's approach cultivated engaged problem-solving. Pain became temporary data rather than permanent damage, a shift in perspective that altered everything. Recruits learned to read physical discomfort as feedback about technique rather than punishment for failure. Muscle fatigue indicated areas for improvement, rather than personal limitation. Exhaustion signaled pacing issues rather than inherent weakness. This reframing transformed the training experience from something endured to something understood, from passive suffering to active learning. The program became about demonstrating personal capability, rather than enforcing compliance, changing the fundamental contract between institution and individual. Self-efficacy beliefs dramatically affect performance under stress, and this became the program's new foundation. Recruits who believed they could overcome challenges consistently performed better than those who expected to fail. The Dominion's approach systematically destroyed this belief, assuming broken confidence created obedient soldiers. The human method demonstrated that unshakable self-belief created unstoppable soldiers. The difference wasn't just psychological. It produced measurable improvements in physical performance, problem-solving ability, and unit cohesion. Confidence proved more effective than compliance across every meaningful metric. Recruits graduated knowing they were stronger than they imagined, carrying this understanding into their military service. They hadn't just survived training, they discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed. This wasn't the false confidence of propaganda, but the earned certainty of demonstrated performance. They'd faced the Dominion's most brutal challenges and emerged not broken but strengthened, not compliant but capable. The strongest weapon became belief in one's own unbreakable potential, a resource that couldn't be confiscated, depleted, or countermeasured. This internal resilience proved more valuable than any external equipment or technology. This philosophical shift would echo across galactic military institutions, forcing reevaluation of training methods that had stood unchallenged for generations. The evidence was too compelling to ignore. Building soldiers worked better than breaking them. Developing capability produced better results than enforcing obedience. Cultivating confidence created more effective fighters than instilling fear. The revolution began in the training facilities but eventually reached operational doctrine, recruitment strategies, and even weapons development. The understanding that unbreakable soldiers outperformed broken ones changed how multiple civilizations approached military preparation. The transformation represented more than improved training outcomes. It suggested that the Dominion's entire understanding of motivation might be flawed. They'd assumed external pressure created reliability, but the evidence showed internal drive produced better performance. They believed fear ensured compliance, but the data demonstrated that belief in mission created dedication. The shift from breaking to building wasn't just methodological, it was philosophical, changing how institutions understood human performance under pressure and what actually made beings effective in extreme situations. This rethinking would eventually influence far more than military training, reaching into education, organizational management, and even interspecies relations. The understanding that building worked better than breaking had implications far beyond the training grounds. Humanity accidentally became the galaxy's premier military trainers through a process of institutional cross-pollination that nobody had anticipated. Earth's military had expected to learn from more advanced galactic forces, arriving with the humble assumption that technological superiority would correlate with methodological sophistication. Instead, they brought evidence-based training approaches that the Dominion's technological advantages had systematically obscured. The situation revealed how advanced technology can sometimes delay necessary methodological evolution by allowing organizations to compensate for ineffective techniques. With superior hardware and environmental controls, sophisticated technology had permitted the Dominion to avoid developing sophisticated methodology for generations. Their training facilities featured gravity manipulation, environmental control systems, and biometric monitoring that could simulate virtually any combat scenario. Yet their actual training philosophy remained primitive in its psychological approach. They could create perfect stress conditions but lacked understanding of how to use those conditions productively. This pattern appears across military histories. Technological advancement often masks methodological stagnation until someone demonstrates that better approaches exist regardless of available technology. Human approaches filled specific gaps that advanced technology couldn't address, particularly in the psychological and physiological optimization realms. Low-technology solutions often drive innovation in high-technology environments, precisely because they focus on fundamental principles rather than surface-level capabilities. Where the Dominion used technology to create stress, humans used understanding to manage it. Their methods emphasize the stress recovery adaptation cycle that turns challenge into capability, rather than trauma. The technological solutions had been treating symptoms while the methodological approach addressed causes. The human combination of rigorous discipline and passionate optimization became the new galactic standard. Through demonstrated effectiveness, rather than theoretical superiority, their approach wasn't technologically advanced but methodologically sophisticated, focusing on how beings actually respond to challenge rather than how they should respond according to doctrine. This shift represented more than just new techniques. It was a different understanding of what training should accomplish and how it should achieve those goals. The focus moved from breaking spirits to building capabilities, from enforcing compliance to developing competence. Galactic training standards would never return to their previous state because the evidence was too compelling to ignore. Multiple civilizations adopted the revised methods once they witnessed the performance differences between broken soldiers and built soldiers. The transformation extended beyond military applications into broader organizational development, influencing how institutions across the galaxy approached challenge and growth. The understanding that building worked better than breaking had implications for education, corporate training, and even interspecies relations. The ultimate success demonstrated that simpler solutions, when applied with insight and passion, can often outperform more complex technologically advanced methods. The Dominion system had focused on the application of stress, but missed the recovery and adaptation phases that turn stress into strength. Their technology could create perfect training environments, but couldn't teach how to use those environments effectively. The human approach provided the missing methodological framework that turned advanced technology from a crutch into a tool. This transformation underscored the idea that technological superiority doesn't guarantee methodological effectiveness. The Dominion had the best training facilities in the galaxy, but were using them to implement outdated psychological principles. Human methods, while technologically simpler, were methodologically more advanced because they were based on observable outcomes rather than traditional assumptions. The revolution wasn't about rejecting technology, but about using it more intelligently, pairing advanced capabilities with sophisticated methodology. The final implications reached beyond military training into broader philosophical realms, suggesting that the Dominion's entire approach to capability development might require similar reconsideration. Their focus on breaking rather than building likely affected other areas where compliance was valued over competence, where control was prioritized over capability. The methods that failed in military training probably influenced education systems, organizational management, and institutional design across their civilization. The understanding that began in the training facilities would eventually transform how multiple civilizations approached development across numerous domains. The Dominion initially misinterpreted Mira's approach as exaggerated emotional positivity, rather than a deliberate scientific methodology. Where they saw simple cheerfulness, she practiced systematic stress engineering, rooted in biological principles that were entirely foreign to their philosophy. The difference was fundamental. One system operated on emotional manipulation while the other employed evidence-based stress optimization. This misunderstanding revealed how institutional bias can obscure methodological innovation when it conflicts with established practices. Her methodology relied heavily on the principle of hormesis, where controlled exposure to low-dose stressors triggers adaptive responses that improve resilience rather than causing breakdown. The Dominion's approach involved applying maximum stress without considering adaptation cycles, essentially overwhelming systems until they failed. Mira's method used progressive overload, applying stress, allowing recovery, then slightly increasing the challenge in a structured cycle that built strength systematically. This wasn't about avoiding hardship, but intelligently engaging with it through calculated progression. Recovery strategies proved as crucial as stress exposure in her training program, a concept the Dominion had entirely overlooked. Their system treated recovery as downtime between suffering sessions rather than an integral part of capability development. The stress recovery cycle is fundamental to building physical and mental resilience, yet their methodology prioritized the destruction phase while ignoring the rebuilding process. Mira incorporated specific techniques for stress management, sleep optimization, and nutritional support that turned recovery into active preparation rather than passive waiting. This approach transformed pain from permanent damage into temporary data about current limits. Where the Dominion interpreted physical discomfort as evidence of breakdown, she treated it as feedback about technique and adaptation status. Muscle fatigue indicated areas for improvement rather than personal failure. Exhaustion signaled pacing issues rather than inherent weakness. This cognitive reframing changed the entire training experience from something endured to something understood, from passive suffering to active learning. The program evolved into a laboratory for evidence-based performance enhancement rather than psychological demolition. Recruits became participants in their own development rather than subjects of institutional experimentation. They learned to read their physiological responses as information, understanding how different stressors affected their performance and adaptation. This shift from external imposition to internal understanding represented a complete transformation in how training was conceptualized and implemented. The personal transformation of individuals mirrored the institutional transformation occurring within the Crucible program. As recruits developed greater capability through intelligent stress engagement, the program itself evolved from a braking machine into a capability development system. The methods that initially seemed like disruptive positivity revealed themselves as sophisticated performance science that produced measurably better results. The Dominion's focus on maximum stress without recovery had been generating unnecessary casualties while achieving inferior outcomes. This scientific approach to stress optimization eventually influenced training methodologies across multiple galactic military organizations. The understanding that controlled exposure builds capability, while uncontrolled exposure causes breakdown, became the new standard. Recovery ceased being viewed as downtime and became recognized as active preparation. The entire philosophy shifted from breaking individuals to building them, from causing trauma to developing resilience, from enforcing compliance to cultivating competence. The real revolution wasn't in the stress application, but in its intelligent management. The Dominion had the technology to create perfect training environments, but lacked the methodology to use them effectively. Their advanced systems were being employed to implement primitive psychological principles, while simpler human methods produced better results through smarter application. The difference wasn't technological but philosophical. One system saw stress as punishment while the other saw it as information. This transformation demonstrated that the most advanced training methodology isn't about the intensity of stress applied but the intelligence of its application. Building capability requires understanding stress responses rather than simply maximizing them. Developing resilience involves managing recovery as carefully as challenge. The program that began as psychological warfare evolved into performance science, because the evidence was too compelling to ignore. The methods that produced broken soldiers were replaced by those that built unbreakable ones. Mira didn't break the system. She revealed it was already broken. The Crucible program had been considered perfect in its design and execution for centuries. A model of institutional efficiency that operated with the smooth precision of machinery that had solved the problem of military training. Its reputation rested on predictable outcomes and consistent performance metrics that never varied across species or cycles. This supposed perfection actually represented profound limitation, a system so rigid it couldn't recognize its own constraints until confronted with someone operating outside its parameters. Single Recruit demonstrated that perfection was actually confinement. When she treated psychological warfare as performance art and physical challenges as engineering problems, her different engagement revealed possibilities the system's designers never considered because they'd stopped questioning their own assumptions generations earlier. Systems often contain unexamined limitations that prevent recognizing better methodologies, and the Crucible had become a perfect example of institutional blindness masquerading as operational excellence. What looked like functionality was actually predictable failure to innovate, a pattern repeating itself with mechanical regularity across 8 standard cycles. Organizational inertia often prevents recognizing better methodologies even when they produce demonstrably superior results. The Dominion had become so invested in their breaking philosophy that they couldn't conceive of alternatives, treating deviation as malfunction rather than improvement opportunity. Their metrics tracked failure rates rather than capability development, measuring how effectively they broke spirits rather than how well they built soldiers. This institutional myopia meant the program wasn't broken. It was operating at a fraction of its potential, using advanced technology to implement primitive psychological principles while calling it sophistication. Mira didn't disrupt the system. She revealed what it could become when freed from its self-imposed limitations. Her approach demonstrated that the same facilities and equipment could produce better outcomes through different methodology, that the problem wasn't the tools, but how they were being used. The program designed to break individuals could instead build them. The technology intended to create suffering could instead develop capability. The philosophy centered on obedience could instead cultivate competence. This wasn't destruction, but revelation, showing what had been possible all along if anyone had thought to look beyond tradition. The final lesson was about the purpose and power of adversity itself, reframing challenge from punishment to opportunity. Where the Dominion viewed hardship as something to be endured until breaking occurred, Mira treated it as information about current limits and growth potential. Pain became temporary data rather than permanent damage. Exhaustion signaled pacing issues rather than personal failure, and stress indicated areas for development rather than evidence of inadequacy. This cognitive reframing transformed the entire training experience from something done to recruits into something done with them. The Crucible's transformation from breaking machine to capability development system demonstrated that institutional change often begins with someone refusing to play by established rules. Mira's different engagement wasn't rebellion but redefinition, showing that the most effective way to change a system might be to demonstrate what it could become rather than attacking what it is. Her methods revealed that building soldiers worked better than breaking them, that developing capability produced better results than enforcing obedience, that cultivating confidence created more effective fighters than instilling fear. This understanding eventually spread beyond military training into broader organizational philosophy, suggesting that the Dominion's entire approach to adversity might require similar reconsideration. Their focus on breaking rather than building likely influenced education systems, management practices, and institutional design across their civilization. The revolution that began in the training facilities would eventually transform how multiple civilizations approached challenge and growth, replacing destruction with development and fear with understanding. The strongest weapon became belief in one's own unbreakable potential, and the galaxy's military training would never be the same. The strongest weapon in the universe isn't technology, it's belief in one's own unbreakable potential. Consider what systems in your own life operate on unexamined assumptions about breaking versus building. The line between punishment and pedagogy dissolves when adversity becomes a resource rather than a threat. Mira didn't break the system. She revealed what it could become. Her perspective transformed destruction into discovery. proving that growth requires engagement rather than endurance. The Crucible's evolution demonstrates that the most effective training builds capability rather than breaks spirits, a lesson extending far beyond military applications into how we all approach challenge.